Since I was lecturing to an empty classroom anyway, I thought I would just shoot this one at home. So we'd relax and talk a little bit. Midterm exam for 7th edition, Zombie Apocalypse, Gary Phillips. This is specifically for my class or someone using the midterm exam format that I use. It's a little different. There are 3 parts to the exam. The first part tests your content retention. If you remember in the chapter 4 lecture, part 2, we talked about the evaluation sheet on page 75, and there are places where your midterm exam are recorded. Content retention, distinction, analysis application, and creation application. So we go through different steps in the midterm exam to access and use information differently. This goes along with Bloom's taxonomy and different levels of learning. So that first chapter, or the first step, deals with part 1 of the exam, content retention. How well did you retain information about the terminology and your ability to use that terminology? That would be seen basically as here is a term, here is a definition. Can you select from the list and put the correct ones together? As that would apply to chapter 1, let's go over to the model of communication on page 16. You see that model in the book. 16 has the complete model, the final version. There are a list of terms. Can you match those with the definition if you were to see those? If you're not sure, flip over to the glossary after chapter 5. There's a list of all the terms from all the chapters, and that's where part 1 would come from. So if you feel comfortable, you can use those terms and discuss them and you know what they are, you're in good shape for part 1. Part 2 is an application part. I would show you a video of communication and ask you to use this model to analyze what's going on. So I might ask you to discuss the interference in this particular situation, or what is the encoding? How is the message encoded? And then I might ask you, could that have been encoded better? Or could we overcome this interference? So analyzing it to find, one, distinguishing what is the interference, and then analyzing it to make a suggestion to improve. That would come in part 2. Another element in part 2, which I may have talked about in some of the classes, is the cheat sheet. I've given you a card and you can make a cheat sheet as you prepare for the exam of information. So as I look at this model, if there are certain things I don't know or feel comfortable with, like encoding and decoding, I might put those on my cheat sheet. If I think I know them, then I don't need to put them on my cheat sheet. This is one of the goals of the midterm. Let me talk about part 3, and then I want to talk about the goals of the midterm. Part 3, this would be seen, I might show you a video clip of communication and ask you to draw a model of that. So this is a picture of a person giving a speech. But if I show you a video clip of a couple on a first date, it would look very different from this. I would want you to create a brand new model, and the interference would be different given the clip you see as opposed to the one in the book. So the model would need to match or reflect the situation that we see, but you would have to create that model. If I ask you to create a new introduction for a speech that you watched, then you would have to come up with an attention getter and a preview that would reflect the main points of that speech, because an introduction should have at least those 2 components, and we talked about that in chapter 3 and 4. So that's how the 3 steps would play out. An exam often has the primary purpose of assessing content retention for students, and questions are designed to gather that or assess how much of this information have you retained. While that is a goal for this exam, it is the 3rd goal, not the 1st goal. It's the least important of the 3. I want to know, did you get the information? Yes. But more important, I want you to realize if you got the information. That's where self-assessment comes into play. And that's part of the reason I use that cheat sheet for part 2 of the exam, the analysis part. You can make a cheat sheet to use during the analysis of part, But first, you need to do a self-assessment to figure out what of the 5 chapters do I need to put on my card and what do I not need to put. Because if it's in my head, I don't need it on my card. The first and primary goal of the midterm is learning. I will put you in situations where you can apply the information in a way that you will learn it more fully. Especially in group 3, there will be things I ask that you don't know, and you have to learn that from other people in the room in your communication interaction. So that's why the midterm is not worth many points directly, but it is worth a lot more points indirectly because it will affect your outline and your performance in the speeches that come up. Chapter 1 talks about several other things like situation analysis, audience analysis, communication apprehension. Those are all related back to that model. So if you have a grasp of that model, you're in good shape for Chapter 1. Chapter 2 introduces some new organizational patterns in your speeches. You should know those. Chronological pattern, problem solution pattern, informative, and cause effect. Be familiar with those. Can you identify them if you see them in a speech? Could you make a speech outline using those if I ask you to? That would be important because you might need to know those for a speech. Beyond that, Chapter 2 primarily deals with attention getters. If I ask you, you watched this speech, the introduction was not very good, write a new introduction, I will expect an opening attention getter, something from Chapter 2. Then a preview of the main points, which would reflect the main points you saw in the speech. That would be a level 3 creation. If I ask you to identify what's there, that could be in level 2. If I ask you to create a new one, that would be a level 3 question or a part 3 question. Moving on to Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, you have some new organizational patterns, topical in the object speech and spatial in the hometown speech. And then you have problem solution as a persuasive pattern in the 3C speech. So the difference, again, being it's a current problem and a future solution. If it's an informative speech, they're both past tense. So that would be important to remember the difference of those and how you can apply those in Chapter 3. Other things in Chapter 3, we introduced central idea and specific purpose. And I might ask you, in this speech, write the specific purpose and central idea for that speech. What do you think it was? And it would be important to know those. And those are on page 38 and 39 if you're not familiar with those. I will also expect those in your outline for level 4 and level 5. We discussed mapping, which includes previews, reviews, preview in the introduction, review in the conclusion, signposting, my first point, my second point, my third point is, and transitional statements. Now that we've talked about red apples, let's talk about yellow apples, moving me from one point to the other point. So mapping techniques are important. The chapter talks about meaningful movement. That's not on your midterm because that's hard to assess in a midterm. And we talked about group work and doing interviews. Also important information, but not on your midterm. Understanding power is very important if you're working in groups, but not on your midterm. Chapter 4, we move into some more detailed application of some of the things you've learned. So there's not a lot of new information. There are some things you need to know, especially for doing your speeches. And the heart of Chapter 4 lectures came in 2 places: that outline and understanding the components of the outline, the way we've expanded it into an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, the supporting points, the supporting information, citing your information, having a bibliography. And remember, your specific purpose central idea statement and your bibliography are part of your outline, but not part of your speech. So you don't share those with the audience, just with me. So being familiar with that outline, understanding all those parts would be important. Again, the mapping we talked about, research we talked about, All of that's important, especially if I ask you to demonstrate or create something in level 3. Being able to identify those internal citations or transitional statements, maybe in part 2 of the exam. Interviewing is not on that interviewing help toolbox is not on the midterm. So that moves us to chapter 5. The basic material that's new in chapter 5 is Monroe's motivated sequence. You need to know those 5 steps. You will need to know them for your level 5 outline and speech, so you might as well learn them for exam. Attention, problem, solution, benefits, action. They move you all the way from the introduction to the conclusion. So in this specific persuasive speech, you don't have introduction, body, conclusion. The outline moves you all the way through. Although really, if you look at the body of the speech for your preview and a review, the body is going to be the problem, solution, benefits. That's where all your content comes. Opening attention getter is still an opening attention getter. The action step, which should be part of your conclusion, closing attention getter, call for action, and closing attention getter to wrap it up. So knowing those 5 steps, those come from the reflective thinking sequence. It would be good to be familiar with those 7 steps. Those are handy tools, and they may not be on the midterm, and they may, but they are handy tools to have. So basically, identifying the problem, defining it, analyzing it, coming up with criteria for measuring and knowing what you want, generating possible solutions, which is where we could use a brainstorming session, which we've done in class, selecting the best step, implementing it, and then evaluating it afterwards to see if it worked. Those are all good things to know. So that is the heart of chapter 5, and those are the things you need to know for the midterm exam.